The wind on that high prairie had a voice, and it never spoke a kind word. It was a language of pure abrasion, a constant sculptor of the land and the people who dared to live upon it. For Alara, newly a widow at 32, the wind was the sound of what was left. It was the scouring of a life down to its barest, most unforgiving bones. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man who understood the wind, who had built their small cabin with its back turned to the prevailing northwesterlies, a gesture of defiance that the wind now seemed to mock with every gust that rattled the window panes. He had been taken not by the wind, but by a fever that had burned through him with the speed of a prairie fire, leaving Alara in a landscape of ash and silence, punctuated only by that incessant keening howl. The cabin was all that remained. It sat on 100 acres of land that was mostly rock and stubborn grass, a parcel deemed worthless by every sensible farmer in the county. Thomas had bought it for a song, charmed by the stark beauty of the place, by the way the sky felt bigger here than anywhere else on earth. Alara had loved it for his sake, but now, alone, she saw it with different eyes. She saw the thin walls, the roof that sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, the way the floorboards drank the cold up from the ground beneath. It was October, and the sky already held the color of old pewter, a promise of the winter to come. The old-timers in the nearby town of Prospect's Folly spoke of winter in hushed tones, as if it were a living beast that stalked the plains from November until April, devouring the unprepared. Her savings were a shallow pool, evaporating with each trip to town for flour and lamp oil. The sympathy of her neighbors, genuine at first, had curdled into a kind of pitying concern that felt sharper than outright scorn. They saw a woman alone, a small cabin, and an unforgiving winter on the horizon, and they arrived at a simple, brutal calculation. She would not make it. The whispers followed her through the general store, soft as the rustle of dry leaves. A liability, they called her. A tragedy waiting to happen. The town council, a grim tribunal of 3 weathered men in starched collars, had summoned her to a meeting in the drafty town hall. Mr. Alistair Thorne had been the one to speak. He was a man whose wealth had been built on acquiring the land of those who failed, a patient vulture circling the misfortunes of others. His face was a mask of civic duty, but his eyes held the flat, predatory gleam of a man who smelled an opportunity. He owned the sprawling ranch that bordered her own meager 100 acres. He cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound. "We are concerned for your welfare, Alara. Deeply concerned. Winter on this plateau is no place for a woman in your circumstances. The cabin is inadequate. It is, to be frank, a death trap." The other 2 men, Mr. Hemlock and Mr. Gable, nodded in solemn agreement, their faces arranged in masks of paternalistic gravity. Thorne continued, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I am prepared to make you an offer. For the land. It's not worth much, as you know. Poor grazing. But to consolidate my holdings, I will give you a fair price, enough to see you settled somewhere more suitable. Back east, perhaps, where you have family." It was not a question. It was a directive packaged as a kindness. The price he named was an insult, barely enough to cover the cost of a train ticket and a few months' rent in a city boarding house, where she would be just as alone, but surrounded by brick and noise instead of sky and wind. She looked at their faces, at the certainty etched into the lines around their eyes. They had already decided her fate. She was a problem to be managed, a loose thread to be neatly snipped. The wind outside rattled the tall windows of the hall, as if to underscore their verdict. In that moment, something inside her, a thing she thought had died with Thomas, flickered to life. It was a cold, hard ember of pure defiance. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But the land was my husband's. I will not be selling it." Thorne's mask of concern tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners of his mouth. "That is an unwise, and I might say, a foolish decision. We cannot be held responsible for what happens to you out there. Think of the community. Think of the burden you might become. The burden. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was already a burden. Her grief was a burden. Her poverty was a burden. Her very existence as a woman alone was a burden to the tidy, masculine order of things. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly. I have thought about it. My decision is final. She walked out of the town hall without another word, the sound of the great oak door closing behind her echoing like a gavel. She had drawn a line in the dust. On one side were sense, reason, and the collective wisdom of Prospect's Folly. On the other was her, a lone woman with 100 worthless acres, and a cabin that was a death trap. The walk back to her land was long, the wind a constant physical push against her. With every step, Thorne's words echoed in her mind. A death trap. Was he right? She looked at the cabin as she approached, seeing it as he must see it. A flimsy box of wood and nails, utterly exposed on the vast, open plain. The sun was low, casting long skeletal shadows from the few stunted trees that dotted the landscape. The cold was already seeping into her bones, a deep, invasive chill that had little to do with the temperature. Despair was a cold thing. It settled in the marrow. She spent the next few days in a fog of grim acceptance. She chopped wood until her hands were raw, stacking it against the western wall of the cabin, knowing it would not be enough. She patched the chinking between the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass, a futile gesture against a wind that could peel the bark from trees. Each night she lay in her cold bed and listened to the house argue with the wind, the wood groaning and creaking in a language of stress and imminent failure. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a ship slowly taking on water in a vast, indifferent ocean. Mr. Thorne was right. It was foolish. It was madness. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the relentless wind and the even more relentless thoughts in her head, she descended the rickety ladder into the root cellar. Thomas had dug it himself, a small, square room carved out of the earth beneath the cabin's main floor. The air down there was different. It was still and quiet, the roar of the wind muted to a distant whisper. It was cool, but it was not the biting, aggressive cold of the world above. It was a steady, neutral temperature, the kind of cool that preserves. She ran her hand along the earthen wall. It was damp and firm, smelling of deep soil and minerals. It was the smell of permanence. And then a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was of her grandfather, a man who had survived the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, a man whose face was a road map of hardship. He had been a man of few words, but the ones he spoke were heavy with the weight of experience. He had once told her when she was just a child complaining about the summer heat, "The world shouts at you, girl. The sun shouts, the wind shouts, the cold shouts. But the earth just whispers. You gotta learn to listen to the whisper." He had lived in what he called a dugout, a home built into the side of a hill. People thought he was poor. He said he was smart. The earth, he'd said, is the only blanket that's warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Ilara stood there in the quiet dark of the root cellar, the cool earth beneath her feet, her grandfather's words echoing in the silence. The earth is the only blanket. The world shouts, but the earth whispers. She looked at the earthen walls around her, at the way they held the quiet and the steady temperature. She looked up at the floorboards of the cabin above, where the wind was still shrieking its threats. A death trap, Thorne had called it. Inadequate. Exposed. He was thinking about the cabin as a thing that had to fight the winter, to stand up against it. But what if that was the wrong way to think? What if the goal was not to fight the winter, but to hide from it? An idea began to form, a wild and audacious concept that was so contrary to common sense that it made her feel a giddy, terrifying thrill. It was an idea born of desperation and a half-forgotten piece of ancestral wisdom. She would not fortify the cabin from the inside. She would not stack more wood or patch more chinking. She would give the cabin a blanket of earth. She would not build up the walls to fight the wind. She would bring the earth up to meet the walls, to swallow the cabin, to bury it, leaving only the roof and a door and a chimney exposed. She would turn the entire structure into a man-made hill, a dugout on the open plain. She would listen to the whisper. The plan was madness. She knew that. But it was a madness that felt, for the first time in months, like hope. It was a plan of action in a world that had rendered her passive. The next morning, she walked the 5 miles into Prospect's Folly. She went straight to Silas Blackwood's general store. Silas was a man who seemed to be made of the same gnarled, resilient material as the land itself. He was practical, taciturn, and possessed a deep-seated skepticism of anything that wasn't tried and true. He had known Thomas, had liked him, and now he looked at Alara with an expression of profound, weary pity. "I need a sturdy shovel," she said, her voice clear and firm. "And the best wheelbarrow you have. And a pickaxe." Silas leaned on the counter, his brow furrowed. "That's heavy work, Alara. Planning on digging a new well?" "No," she said. "Something else." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the new, strange light in her eyes. It was not the flat, dull look of grief he had seen for the past few months. It was something else, something unsettling. He sold her the tools, taking the last of her significant cash. As she was leaving, he stopped her. "Alara, whatever it is you're planning, be careful. The first snow isn't far off." "I know," she said. "That's why I have to hurry." And so the work began. The first swing of the pickaxe into the hard-packed prairie soil was a shock that traveled up her arms and into her shoulders. The ground did not want to yield. It was a stubborn, cohesive mass of clay, rock, and tangled roots. She designated an area 50 feet from the cabin as her quarry. Her plan was simple in concept and monumental in execution. Dig up the earth from the quarry and pile it against the walls of her home. The first day, she worked until her hands were blistered and bleeding, her back a single screaming muscle of pain. The pile of dirt she had managed to move next to the cabin wall looked pathetic, a child's mud pie against the vastness of the prairie. Doubt was a constant companion. Every aching muscle, every blister that broke, every gust of wind that tried to steal the dirt from her shovel, whispered Thorne's words back to her. Foolish. A liability. A death trap. The people of Prospect's Folly soon became aware of her project. Riders on their way to distant pastures would see her, a lone figure toiling with a shovel and wheelbarrow, and they would shake their heads. The story spread through the town, morphing with each telling. She was digging her own grave. She had lost her mind to grief. They started calling her the Mole Woman, a name that was half mockery, half pity. Silas Blackwood would sometimes watch her from the road through his spyglass when he made deliveries out that way. He saw not madness, but a terrifying, methodical determination. He saw her create a system. She would use the pickaxe to break up a section of ground in the morning when she was strongest. Then she would shovel the loosened earth into the wheelbarrow, her movements becoming more economic, less wasteful, as the days wore on. She would push the heavy barrow across the uneven ground to the cabin, dump the load against the wall, and then turn and walk back to do it all again. It was a rhythm of toil, a prayer of labor. He saw her build a ramp of packed earth so she could get the wheelbarrow higher up the growing mound. He saw her stop only to eat a piece of bread or drink some water. He saw her work from sunup to sundown, and he stopped seeing a pitiable widow. He started seeing something he didn't have a name for. The earth grew. Slowly, inexorably, The pile against the northern wall, the one that faced the worst of the wind, began to climb. It rose past the windowsill, then past the halfway point of the wall. She learned the nature of the soil she was moving. The topsoil was light and dusty. Beneath it was the heavy, dense clay that held its shape, that would pack down into a solid, insulating mass. She learned to mix the soils, to water the mound and tamp it down with the back of her shovel, creating a berm that was as solid as a fortress wall. Inside the cabin, the change was palpable. The northern wall, once a source of constant drafts, became silent and still. The room held its warmth longer after the fire in the stove died down. These small victories were her fuel. One afternoon, Alistair Thorne rode out to her property, his fine horse a stark contrast to the raw earthwork surrounding the cabin. He reined in his horse and looked down at her, his face a thundercloud of indignation. "What, in God's name, do you think you are doing, woman?" he boomed, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "You are creating an eyesore, a pile of dirt. This is an abomination. You are devaluing my property with this filth." Alara leaned on her shovel, her arms and back trembling with exhaustion. She was covered in dirt, her hair matted with sweat and dust. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "I'm insulating my home, Mr. Thorne." He scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're burying it. This is madness. I warned you. The council will have to take action. This is a public nuisance, a danger." He gestured at the mound. "What happens when that collapses?" "It won't collapse," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm packing it. It's stable." "Stable? It's a pile of dirt. You've gone mad. Sell the land, Alara, before you bring ruin upon yourself and this entire community. This is my final offer." "No," she said. The word was small, but it was absolute. Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight with fury. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The confrontation left her shaken, but also strangely solidified in her purpose. His anger was the anger of a man whose worldview was being challenged. He could not comprehend what she was doing, and so he had to label it madness. His lack of imagination was not her problem. She picked up her shovel and went back to work, her rhythm a steady beat against his receding anger. Dig, lift, push, dump, tamp, return. She worked her way around the cabin, wall by wall. The west wall, then the east. She left the south wall, with the door and the largest window, for last. The berms rose until they met the eaves of the roof. The cabin was disappearing, sinking into the prairie. It looked ancient, primal, a thing that had grown out of the land rather than being built upon it. The physical toll was immense. She grew leaner, her muscles corded and hard. Her hands were calloused and permanently stained with soil. But her mind was clear. The physical labor scoured away the grief, leaving a core of pure, unyielding purpose. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. She was not a victim of the landscape. She was a partner with it. By mid-November, the work was done. The cabin was nestled within a massive, sloping mound of earth, 3 to 4 feet thick at the top and tapering down to a base nearly 15 feet wide. Only the roof, the chimney, and the front facade with its door and window were visible. She had built a low stone retaining wall around the entrance to keep the earth from encroaching. From a distance it looked less like a house and more like a strange, solitary hill with a chimney sticking out of it. The first snows came, light flurries that dusted the prairie white. The wind still howled, but now it flowed up and over the smooth, rounded contours of her earthen walls. Inside, the silence was profound. It was a silence she had not known since Thomas died, a silence that was not empty, but full of peace. The town's mockery reached its peak. The mole woman had finally buried herself. They laughed about it in the saloon and whispered about it over the church pews. Silas Blackwood said nothing. He had sold her the last of her supplies, a large stock of flour, beans, salted pork. and enough lamp oil to last for months. He had seen the quiet confidence in her eyes. He had felt the stillness inside her strange, earthen home when he had delivered the goods. He did not understand it, but he had stopped doubting it. Then came the blizzard. It did not arrive like the other storms, with a gradual darkening of the sky and a gathering of clouds. It descended upon the plains like a judgment. The sky turned a sickening shade of gray-white, and the world dissolved into a churning vortex of wind and snow. The temperature plummeted, a freefall into a cold so deep it felt like it could crack steel. It was a storm that erased the horizon, that buried landmarks, that made the very act of breathing an agony. They would later call it the White Death, the blizzard of '88. In Prospect's Folly, panic set in quickly. The wind, a screaming banshee, tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. Snow, fine as sand, forced its way through every crack and crevice, piling in ghostly dunes inside people's homes. The train was stranded miles away, cutting off the town's supply of coal. Woodpiles, left exposed, were buried under impassable drifts. The temperature dropped to 30, then 40 below zero, and the wind chill was a number that had no meaning on a human scale. It was simply the absolute negation of warmth. Alistair Thorne's large, modern house, the pride of the county, became his prison. The wind found its way through the newfangled window frames. The generator for his electric lights failed on the first night. His state-of-the-art furnace, reliant on a steady supply of coal he could no longer get to, sputtered and died. He and his family huddled in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive, listening to the house groan and shudder around them as if it were being torn apart by giant, invisible hands. The shouting world had come for him, and his fine, expensive house was shouting back in terror. On the second day of the storm, a thought pushed its way into Silas Blackwood's mind, a thought that became an obsession. Alara, the mole woman. He pictured her small, flimsy cabin, and his heart filled with a dreadful certainty. No one could survive this out there. Not in that death trap. The mockery of the townspeople seemed like a grim prophecy. He felt a pang of guilt, a feeling that he should have done more, forced her to come to town, to abandon her mad project. Driven by this fear, he did something that everyone else would have called suicide. He decided to go to her. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned, tied a rope from his storefront to the next building, and then the next, fighting his way through the maelstrom. The visibility was less than 5 feet. The wind was a solid wall that knocked him down time and again. It was a journey of instinct and memory, following a road he could no longer see. It took him 3 hours to travel the 5 miles, a journey that felt like a descent into a frozen hell. He nearly gave up a dozen times, the cold leaching the strength from his limbs and the will from his mind. But the image of Alara, frozen and alone, pushed him forward. He found the cabin more by luck than by navigation. He stumbled over the beginning of the earthen berm, the only feature in a landscape that had been wiped clean and white. The world was a screaming chaos of white noise and blinding snow, but as he climbed the mound, the sound lessened. He slid down the other side towards the exposed southern wall. The wind was baffled here, creating a pocket of relative calm. He saw the window, a faint, warm, yellow rectangle glowing in the gray maelstrom. And he saw something that made him stop, his heart pounding in his chest. From the small stone chimney, a thin, steady plume of gray smoke rose, bent sharply by the wind, but unbroken. It was a sign of life, a sign of impossible, defiant life. He stumbled to the door, his limbs numb, his beard a solid mass of ice. He hammered on the thick wood with his frozen fist. For a moment there was no answer, and a fresh wave of panic seized him. Then he heard the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door opened. Alara stood there, bathed in the warm, gentle light of an oil lamp. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her hair was tidy. In her hand she held a book, her finger marking her place. She looked at him, her expression one of mild surprise, not alarm. "Silas, what on earth are you doing out in this?" He could not speak. He could only stare. He stared past her into the cabin. A small, efficient fire crackled in the cast-iron stove, its heat radiating through the single room. A kettle was steaming gently on its surface. The air was warm, not hot, but a deep, comfortable, even warmth. It was quiet. The apocalyptic roar of the blizzard, the defining reality of his world for the past 48 hours, was gone. Here, inside this earthen womb, it was a distant murmur, a rumor of a storm happening far away. He could hear the crackle of the fire. He could hear the soft hiss of the lamp. He could hear his own ragged, unbelieving breaths. He finally found his voice, a cracked and frozen whisper. How? He staggered inside, and she closed the door, shutting out the last of the storm's muted roar. He looked around the small, warm space, at the neat stack of books, the sleeping cat curled on a rag rug by the hearth. It was an oasis of impossible peace in the heart of a frozen apocalypse. It was a miracle. "It's the earth," she said, her voice calm and simple, as if she were explaining the most obvious thing in the world. "The frost only goes so deep. Below that, the ground holds a steady temperature. All this dirt, it's a blanket. It keeps the wind out and it holds the stove's heat in. I don't need a big fire, just a small one to keep it comfortable." She gestured to the stove. "I've only used a fraction of the wood I thought I would." She had not been fighting the storm. She had been sleeping through it. Silas sank into a chair, the warmth seeping into his frozen body. So profound and welcome it was almost painful. He looked at her. At this woman the town had called mad, the woman he himself had pitied. He saw no madness. He saw a wisdom that was older and deeper than all the common sense and Prospect's folly combined. He saw the quiet, unassailable triumph of someone who had listened to the whisper instead of the shouting. "I'll be damned," he breathed, the words fogging in the warm air. He sat there for a long time, drinking the hot tea she gave him, and for the first time in 2 days, he felt the knot of fear in his belly unwind. He was safe. He was warm. The mole woman had saved him. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. When it finally broke, the world was reborn in a shroud of white under a sky of impossible blue. The silence that fell was as profound as the storm's fury had been. Prospect's Folly was a town entombed. Drifts buried houses to their rooftops. The official count would later find that 17 people had frozen to death in their own homes, including Alistair Thorne and his entire family, found huddled in their grand living room, the last of their fine mahogany chairs broken and charred in the fireplace. The town was a landscape of grief and devastation. When Silas and Alara emerged from the cabin, the sun on the snow was blinding. They walked back to town, a journey made arduous by the sheer depth of the snow. As they approached, people began to emerge from their buried homes, digging themselves out like survivors from a fallen city. They saw Silas, who they had presumed lost, and then they saw the woman beside him, Alara, alive. And not just alive, but looking rested and whole. The whispers that followed them now were not of mockery, but of stunned, disbelieving awe. The story spread, carried by Silas, its truth undeniable and potent. He told them of the quiet, the warmth, the impossible sanctuary she had built. He told them how she had not battled the storm, but had simply refused to acknowledge its power. In the weeks that followed, as the town dug out and counted its losses, a slow procession of people made the trek out to Alara's land. They came not to mock, but to see. They stood in silence before the strange, snow-covered hill, looking at the wisp of smoke from its chimney, and they understood. They had tried to shout back at the winter and had been broken by it. She had listened to the earth's whisper and had been sheltered by it. They stopped calling her the Mole Woman. At first, they didn't know what to call her. She was simply the woman who had survived. Then, as spring came and the earth she had moved began to sprout with prairie grasses, solidifying her creation into a living part of the landscape, they began to call her something else. They came to her with questions. Men who had farmed this land their whole lives came to her, hats in hand, to ask how she did it. They asked about the depth of the soil, the angle of the slope, the way to manage the dampness. She answered them simply, sharing what she had learned through labor and observation. That next summer, the first new house built in the valley was a small cabin, nestled into the side of a south-facing hill. The summer after that, 3 more were built, their walls bermed with thick blankets of earth. The method, once the subject of ridicule, became the new vernacular of survival. The houses were cheaper to build, requiring less lumber. They were cooler in the brutal summer heat, and, as everyone now knew, they were invincibly warm in the winter. They were not just houses, they were a covenant with the land, an admission that true strength lay not in opposition but in accommodation. Alara never sought recognition. She lived out her days in her quiet, earthen home, her solitude now a mark of respect, not pity. She became a quiet fixture of the community, a source of deep, practical wisdom. The children of the people who had mocked her grew up in warm, safe, earth-sheltered homes, and they knew of Alara as a founder, a figure of local legend who had taught their grandparents how to listen. Decades later, long after she was gone, a traveler passing through that high prairie country would have noticed the peculiar architecture, the way the homes seemed to grow from the rolling hills, their grassy roofs blending into the landscape. They might have thought it was an ancient tradition, a building style passed down for centuries. And in a way, they would have been right. For the wisdom Alara had uncovered was ancient. It was a truth that had always been there, whispering just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to be desperate enough, or brave enough, or quiet enough, to bend down and listen. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations are not a leap into the future, but a return to a knowledge we have forgotten, a lesson taught not in the shouting of the wind or the blaze of the sun, but in the deep, steady, and eternal silence of the earth.